Hi guys, starting marking period 2, we're going to start keeping science archives, which is just a fancy way of saying we're going to start keeping a notebook on our iPad that includes all the activities and labs that we do so that it makes it easier for us to reflect on what we learned by doing something. And this is really important because you know that if you do an activity, very often it's fun and interesting, and then what you did sort of slips away over time. So your archive is designed to capture the thinking and to make you go back and rethink what you did after you learn more. So an archive is any record or collection of data, usually an extensive one, meaning it has a lot of stuff in it. Your archives will all be different from each other. I'm going to give you a couple of different options for ways to keep them. My recommendation is that you use the app Book Creator, but you could also use GoodNotes if you prefer. It really depends on what kind of archive you want. The reason I like Book Creator is because it gives you all of these different options over on the right-hand side. You can embed photos, you can embed video, you can write with a pen, you can add text, and you can also add an audio file so that you can just record your voice and implant that wherever you want it. Now, the advantage of adding sound is that sometimes when you're working on a lab, it can be a real pain to sit down and write out what you're doing. But it's much easier to just record, a few words saying, okay, so now we're about to do blah, blah, blah. And that way you have it sort of kept as a record, and then later if you want to go back and add to it with writing, you can. GoodNotes is fine. You can add photos to GoodNotes, you can use a pen, you can add text, but you can't embed videos into GoodNotes and you can't add sound. So those are the two things that you lose. On the next page, I'll show you a typical entry into an archive. Actually, first let me do the rubric. Let me show you that first. Okay, so here is the rubric that I use to grade archives. And what I do is I will pick a random activity that I want to check on, and I'll say, okay, go find your archive for the days that we did, let's say, the acid-base lab. And then you'll go find the archive on your iPad, and I'll actually go around checking your iPad looking to see if these things are included in that entry. Number one, it should be organized logically. I shouldn't have a hard time understanding what's on the page. It should be easy to read and interpret anything that you have there. So if the sound quality is really poor or if your pictures make no sense, that's a little bit of a problem. The archive is for you, but I have to be able to understand it. So I'm not expecting it to be perfect. I'm not expecting, for you to check all your spelling and stuff like that. It's notes to yourself, but if the notes are not useful and I can't interpret them at all, that's a problem. Couple of directions to follow. First of all, you make sure you date each page and put a title on each page. And this annoys the heck out of kids when I take a point off for this because, it can be really frustrating. Like you have this beautiful archive, but you forgot to put a date or a title on the page. I need to know when it happened, you need to know when it happened, and you need to know what it was that you were doing. And then every once in a while I find that students show me their archive for a particular lab and somehow they weren't doing the work that was actually assigned. They were doing something else. This occasionally happens, so I added that to my following directions. Under supporting details, there's two things you got to do. You have to explain what you did, which is easy enough, and then you have to explain what it means. And this is where students tend to fall down. Pardon the bell. Never realized how long those bells were before. Explaining what something means requires that you understand what you learned from the lab. And very often you don't know that until a few days later. Sometimes you do an activity and then later you go back and go, oh, you know what? I think I understand now why this happened or why that happened. So it's really important that you not only put your entry in that says what you did, but later you go back and add to it when you begin to understand what it means. And that's the hardest part for students to get used to. Finally, higher level thinking. You need to demonstrate that you understand the concepts that I taught you. So you should have no misconceptions, or if you did, you corrected them in that later part when you explained what it all meant. You should connect to what was taught in lessons and tutorials. So, for example, you should be referring to the major idea that the lab is about. And that usually has to do with things that we've either read in class or tutorials that I gave you or even lectures that I did. And then finally, you should be able to apply what you've learned to the lab setting And what that means is that you're able to take the ideas that we were learning about in lessons and use them in the lab in some meaningful way. So we learned, for example, what forces are, and then you were able to apply what you knew about forces to understanding the lab that you were doing. All of that is complicated. You can redo an archive rubric, an archive entry if you need to. And I usually check archives a couple of times a marking period. So you won't know when I'm going to check, so it's really important that you keep up with your archives. A couple of days before I decide to do an archive check, I usually say, okay, sometime this week I'm going to do an archive check. And that way, that'll give you a chance to maybe go back and add in your reflections on what it all means, and maybe fix any misconceptions that you had. And that's the whole point, is for you to revisit the lab first when you do it, and then again later after you've had some time to think about it. Let me show you a sample one. We haven't done this lab yet, but we will. And what this student has done is they took a picture of what they were doing in class, and they snapped that photo and then they imported it to the page. So you can kind of get a real quick look at what they were doing. And what they were doing was they had a straw that was in some water, and they blew over the top of the straw, and that made water come up the straw that's in the water. And this is what they wrote. This photo shows a demonstration of Bernoulli's principle. So they're connecting to what they were learning in class. I gave them notes in class on Bernoulli's principle. The water in the straw rises due to the decrease in air pressure above it. So they're showing an understanding of what they learned about Bernoulli's principle. The air above the straw has less pressure because its velocity is increased by the person blowing. Now, you may not understand what they're talking about, and that's okay because you haven't learned this yet, but do you get what they're doing here? They're explaining not only what's happening, but why it's happening. So they don't just tell me, okay, we blew on a straw and some water came out. That's not an archive entry. An archive entry is, this is what we did, and this is what happened as a result. And they even went on to explain what their drawings mean. So over here on the right-hand side, you see it says, in the first drawing, you see liquid water molecules in the straw being kept from rising due to the pressure of the air above. In the second drawing, the air is given forward velocity, so water can now rise. So they drew diagrams showing their understanding of Bernoulli's principle down here. Now again, you don't have to know what Bernoulli's principle is right now, but this really shows me that this student totally gets Bernoulli's principle. They're able to demonstrate it with a diagram. So they've done all the things that I asked them to do. They dated the page. They are missing a title, so I would subtract a half point for that. They should have called this the name of the lab, which was the name of this lab is actually Matter as a Black Box. Matter as a bee box. So it would have been nice if they had labeled it that way. This student did not make use of a video. This student did not put in any sound, but they could have. Instead of these words that they wrote above and to the right, they could have done sound files. And instead of a picture, they could have put a video in. That would have been fine. And that may even have been better in some ways, because maybe they would have had more time to say more in their sound file, and that's okay as well. So that's the idea behind the archive. So you should start keeping an archive. Make sure you date your page, put the title of the lab or activity we're doing, and remember, you should go back and make sure that later, after we've finished the lab, that you really understand what it was all about. If you don't, you need to ask for help so you can put it in your archive. Okay, see you guys in class.